these two different boundaries here between the modeling consultants, which is kind of these black lines here, and the colored areas, which are the watershed regions. So, we'll be working closely with the folks with Wood and their team, as this boundary along the Ouachita and the Black River is kind of one big floodplain, and so we'll be working closely together to share data and modeling information as we progress through this, and we'll be modeling all this obviously on a Huc 8 watershed scale. So once we get going on the modeling, we'll be identifying flood risks, and then we'll follow that up with start to work on projects for reducing flood risk, which is, I know that's what everybody's anxious to get to. So next steps as we see it, right, DOTD is working on procuring the first task order. And so that'll be some of their next steps. They're going to provide a data request template so that we can make it easy and clear once we start asking for data from communities. We try to make it consistent. On our end with the modeling consultants, we're mobilizing our modeling teams. We're getting ready to begin all this data collection. And that first task order will primarily be data collection and then us developing our watershed modeling approach for all these different locations. So once we get going on that, with the regional steering committees, both regions 2 and 3, we'll be working with y'all along the way, getting your help in terms of assisting with data collection efforts, helping point us in the right direction on finding things. And then once we get these modeling approaches together, I'm sure you'll have the opportunity to provide some input and feedback on that. So that's really all I have. We're excited about getting started on this project, and we're looking forward to working with everyone. It's going to be fun, and we're going to learn a lot, and ultimately work together to reduce flood risk there in Region 3.
Thank you, Jim. Again, this is the map, the full state map. I can send that to the steering committee so you can see that this area here, the teal color is our region, and then there's 2 and 3 within it as far as the modeling. Next up on our agenda is the work plan. Steering committee members, I sent this to you via email this morning, and it's also on the places here. This is just a guide, a working living document. It's just going over what we need to have it approved. That's what the state is asking us to do, is to approve this work plan. That effect, is there a motion on that to approve this? You can see, if y'all need further discussion, at the top we have our meetings. We're talking about the orientation, what months that took place, the development of the inventory, the project funding for round 1, and then the coalition development on here. And again, some of the deadlines are at the top. This will be changing from month to month, to be honest with you. Is there a motion?
Will we accept the Regional Steering Committee work plan?
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. There's a motion and a second to approve this plan. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed likewise. Motion carries. Okay. And again, we'll be getting updates on those regularly. The next thing on our agenda is a discussion of workshops. This is something that we're looking to start in the next month. Hopefully having our first one in August. What this will be is we'll invite the steering committee members, obviously, but then also the people within the various jurisdictions that are involved in project development, because we need to start looking at regional projects for this watershed. And we need people to start talking and collaborating together on those workshops. We're looking at having one mid-August. The site is not confirmed right now, but that is the idea, and we'll probably have 3 or 4 of those within the region. Now, the next question I figure I'm going to get, does everybody have to come to all the meetings? No. If we're having one in West Carroll, you may not, if you're in the southern part of the region, you may not feel like the people that are working on those projects are going to work on something in your area. And that's fine, you don't have to come. But if those in those surrounding areas want to come and start looking at those projects, you would want to come so you can start having those conversations. So we'll be sending out more information about that, but we just wanted y'all to know that it's something that is in the plan. I sent out this week the links and such for the project inventory. The project inventory is due the end of October. So we need to get those things started being entered. The steering committee voted last month for each jurisdiction to enter their own projects. So I sent that email with the links to all of you, all of the parish secretary treasurers, the parish presidents, and the mayors, and to some interested parties that weren't included. They're wanting meeting notices and such. So they got this information. Hopefully they're looking at it and gonna ask me questions. So if any of you get questions and you need me, let me know. Also on my team, Lisa is the floodplain manager. She can help. We'll probably get Gianna involved if she needs to help with that as well. So we have the three of us on the management team that can assist. But if they contact me, we'll go from there. Do any of you have any questions? Tom?
Just a comment, and I said something to you yesterday. I know, like in West Carroll, and we probably got them in other places. Over the last 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, maybe you've got a subdivision or an area of the parish that's just not happy with their flood control, that have kind of organized a little bit, set up a Facebook site. So when you plan these, anybody that knows about these places, because what they have to say and what government has to say may not be the same thing, and they might invite the TV station. I'm just saying.
Yeah. Now, keep in mind these workshops will be open to the public as well. It will be, for those working in the projects as well as the public. But we need to get public participation, but we also need conversation going with those that are actually developing the projects. And I hope y'all think that's a good way to start. That's the way I saw that would be a great method to get started. And having some in August and September. Obviously, COVID is kind of keeping some meeting places closed. We may have to be creative with some of that. But if any of you in your jurisdictions have a location you would like to be considered, let me know. I prefer to have a place where we can get some distance as we need to. Like for this meeting, I originally planned the assembly room because it's much larger. However, couldn't do Zoom and everybody participate in there. This room had the space and tried to space y'all out a little bit. Want to have some of that and have to have room for, I'm going to say 50 people, just because by the time you do any steering committee members, you do any engineers and other project managers, and then the public, you probably need that kind of room. Plus we'll need to be able to put up easels and flip charts and that sort of thing. So that's what we're leading with the workshops, and that will help with project inventory development. Next up, we have a presentation from the state. Ben Wicker is on Zoom. He couldn't join. He planned on joining us live and in person, but he couldn't today, so he's on Zoom. And then here present, we have Matthew Sanders and Brad Spiegel. So they are going to be doing a presentation for us. And this is on flood risk.
Good morning, everyone. Ben Wicker here. My apologies for not being able to attend in person, but I assure you, you'll be seeing a lot more of my face in the coming months. So thank y'all so much for understanding and being patient with the virtual reintroductions. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces. Wanted to also thank everyone for being so patient with, we're dealing with COVID right now. However, our flood risk is not going to go away as storm season is upon us. So we really appreciate your commitment to this group, and we are very much looking forward to seeing Region 3's story unfold.
Yes.
To orient this, yes.
Hold up. Oh, we have someone has a.
The Zoom, it's Brad. The Zoom, can you close maybe it's for Evelyn, can she close the people on Zoom?
That up here maybe.
What's that?
But we're blocking the presentation, Ben. With, yeah, we could maybe just drag off the thing on the right.
Yes, here, I'll do it. Yeah, there we
I
go.
think that's something you have to fix on your end. Yeah.
I need the map.
I didn't. And without the visual, it's just me doing stand-up, so that's not.
It may not be good.
Sorry, Ben, thank you.
Not a problem. So before we dive into, what we're trying to accomplish with this meeting, I wanted to introduce the Resilience Planning Manager for the Office of Community Development, Matthew Sanders. Matt, do you have anything you want to say to the room before we dive in?
No, just that certainly appreciate you hosting us today and your hospitality. It's been a few years since I've made it up to Monroe, so it was definitely nice to come visit and hang out a little bit last night, and looking forward to spending some more time up here in the months and years to come.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. So to orient this discussion, it's important to acknowledge that one of the key objectives of the Watershed Initiative is to use data and science to help us make decisions around how to reduce future flood risk. So we hope this presentation will be a resource to help us carry out this work together. The main objective of today's discussion is to build a common understanding of known flood risks, vulnerabilities, and priorities within Region 3 at a regional watershed scale. To this effect, we'll introduce a tool, build awareness, and kickstart a discussion about known flood risk that leverages your local experiences of flooding. We don't expect to get this right on day one. This will be a rolling exercise, and we're looking for your input throughout this entire process. So I just want to go over some operational notes with everyone. One, this is a public meeting. We are recording it, and this meeting is actually being live streamed to the Watershed's Facebook page, which you can go back and watch afterwards. We're also going to have folks who are going to send us comments through the chat feature on Zoom. And as you have already gathered with my virtual presence, we do have a number of folks who are actually dialing in virtually. We have set aside an hour and a half for this presentation to ensure an adequate time to request and receive public comments, but are prepared to end sooner if appropriate. One more thing, we invite discussion from the Regional Steering Committee members throughout the presentation and encourage sharing of additional information which might enhance our understanding of flood risks in this region. Comments can be shared, as I mentioned, through feedback from unmuted attendees or comments entered into the chat box. Before we dive into the actual flood risk exercise, we do want to point out that this is we're not starting from square one. We are building on previous efforts. We have visited Region 3 a number of times in the past for the listening tour and for those parish leadership meetings. And what we have here is a synthesis of the key points that we've gathered in all of our visits to the region. The first one is to drive collaboration with open, accurate data and academic tools. Second being account for time needed to realize results in flood risk reduction strategies. What we want to do is we actually want to use the time that we have to study the information that we have and use that data to make smart decisions. Next, we want to focus on equity in project cost benefit analysis. And last, we want to provide links for watershed to watershed coordination. Region 3 is very well interconnected with the regions surrounding Region 3. It's very closely connected with Region 2. But beyond that, Region 3 has a number of watersheds within it. Matt, I believe it's 4 different watershed regions actually exist within Region 3, and it's important that we understand how those smaller watershed regions actually interact with one another on a larger scale within Region 3. One thing to remember is that this is your story, and we want to keep it that way. To the best of our abilities, we will work shoulder to shoulder with you and the public to tell it. Next, we're going to just quickly go through the agenda before we dive into the presentation itself. The flood risk presentation itself, we're anticipating will take about 45 minutes. Then we'll take a 5 to 10 minute break so that we can just kind of digest all the information that we're going to be giving to you, and you have a moment to just kind of breathe. And then we'll dive into a flood risk, the mapping exercise and time for public comment. All of that should take about 30 minutes. All righty. Matt, do you want to take us into the flood risk assessment?
Sure, Ben. So first, I just kind of want to explain what we're looking at here and how we're going to present information. So this is called an Esri story map, and in basic terms, it is a map, as the name would imply, that allows us to add data to the map and allows you to use it as a tool to hone in on specific areas that may be of interest to you as we go through some of the data sets, hone in on some of the flood risks that we're going to talk about. So, I'm encouraged to hear that you all are taking it upon yourselves to put together workshops. This may very well be a useful instrument, and you go through those workshops and you discuss the various aspects of flood risk throughout the region itself. So Ben will certainly make this available to everybody coming off of this meeting, and it really should just be a resource for you that helps us capture the best information that we have about flood risk in this region from a desktop perspective, if you will. And I say it that way because it's supposed to be a conversation starter. So I think, as Ben alluded to, certainly feel free to interject as we're going through this presentation today, because we really want to marry the best information that we can develop from outside of this region. Obviously, we're based in Baton Rouge, and connect it with all of the knowledge that you all have as folks that live and work here. So with that in mind, one of the objectives that we want to make sure that we hone in on is to build a common vocabulary. So one of the things that the Watershed Initiative is interested in doing is really beginning to build a baseline level of knowledge for everybody in Louisiana so that we all understand the different types of flood risks that afflict the state. I think it goes without saying that Louisiana is extremely flood prone in general. And I think certainly, if you look just back in the last 15 years, say starting with Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, every part of the state has been impacted by a significant flooding event since that time. So this is something that really connects everybody in Louisiana. And we think it's a topic that everybody does and should certainly take an interest in. The second thing that we want to accomplish is to talk about the specific drivers of flood risk and vulnerability within Region 3. While Louisiana as a whole is extremely vulnerable to flood risks, as I'm sure you all know, those are not all the same types of flood risks. So we want to make sure that we hone in on the discussion of the various waterways and the reasons why water pools in various places, why backwater floods take place, some of the areas that may be more impacted by flash flooding events. We really want to be able to leave the room today and all of us have a good understanding of what we're looking at so that we can begin to talk about solutions in the future. The third thing that we want to do is, as we begin to prime that discussion about solutions, we want to talk about opportunities to potentially take advantage of some of the natural attributes within Region 3. And as we think through projects, are there natural opportunities? Are there wetlands? Are there natural retention basins? Are there places that we can enhance and take advantage of for some benefit to our overall flood risk profile here in this region? So with that said, let's go ahead and dive into the geography. There are 14 parishes in Region 3. I believe this may be the region with the most parishes. Ben, correct me if I'm wrong about that. But it's a fairly...
I believe so.
Go ahead.
I believe that it is the region with the most parishes. That's quite the accomplishment.
And I won't list out the parishes. You all know the region better than I do. But the reason why I point that out, if we want to move to the next image, please. And I will correct Ben on the next image, and that there are not 4 watersheds that interact with this region, but indeed 5. I think that's also a record for our various 8 regions across the state. And so there are a lot of different rivers and tributaries that contribute to flood risk in Region 3. So kind of starting in the northeast, if you will, we've got the Buff Tensas, and then the lower Mississippi Greenville, the lower Mississippi Natchez, the lower Ouachita, and the lower Red. And if you see kind of that pattern within those various watersheds, that does represent the water bodies and tributaries and all the things that can at times overflow. Obviously, as we saw in this region in 2016, can be drivers of fairly significant flooding events throughout Region 3. So in total, we're talking about hydrology, right? Our interest is in understanding how water circulates through a system, where it flows, and how that contributes as a driver of flood risk itself. Before we kind of move on from this high-level understanding of the watersheds within Region 3, Karen, do you have anything you'd like to add? Is there anything specific that we want to make sure we touch on here?
Lisa, do you have anything as a floodplain manager?
Just our flooding sources. We have a lot of backwater, flash flooding.
Can we make sure that y'all speak closer to the microphone so that the folks dialing in can hear? We're just having a little trouble with that audio being away from the mic.
Gotta project.
Just touch on our flooding sources, I think would be the main objective of today. The backwater flooding, the flash flooding, riverine flooding, and the other definitions, alluvial and fluvial. So yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, we'll talk about that common vocabulary and fluvial and fluvial, right? It's I guess they're twins. Speaking of, we'll talk about the types of flood risk now. So one of the things that we're going to do is I want to start with coastal surge flooding. And the reason why I want to do this is not to aggravate y'all and talking about a type of flooding that you don't experience here. Can we click on the link, please? We want to start here because I think you all know and understand that the state has spent a lot of time, money, and effort really developing a good understanding of our coastal surge flood risk, right? We're very proud of our coastal master plan. We're very proud of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority and all the work that they've done. And we want to start here because, first of all, it's one of the 3 types of flood risk that we'll talk about specifically. But one of the objectives of the Watershed Initiative is to help us understand our other types of flood risk that we experience in regions like Region 3 in the same way that we understand our flood risk along the coast. And so we just wanted to touch on this briefly because we know a lot about the coast. We're certainly not going to talk about it a whole lot in this meeting, but this level of understanding is where we're trying to go across the entire state. Can we move on to fluvial, please? So, like I said, very quickly moving off the coast and into flood risk topics that are germane to Region 3. Fluvial flooding, river floods. So this is a type of flooding that, as the name would imply, happens when an abundance of rain, either directly within a region or somewhere upstream along a river, takes place, and that water then overflows a river's banks and contributes to flood risk itself in a particular location. And then the final type of flood risk that we'll talk about is pluvial flooding with a P. And so pluvial flooding is most common in more well-developed areas, so places with a lot of impervious surfaces, places where runoff is maybe not ideal, and water can pool, and ultimately streets and in some cases homes can flood out from extreme rainfall events that happen in well-developed areas. So let's go ahead. And finally, we did want to talk about backwater flooding, even though it's kind of a subset of fluvial flooding or river floods. And I'm going to butcher this name, Bayou de
Desir.
Desir. I would have never gotten that right. Thank you. And essentially, it's when there's an obstruction of some kind combined with an abundance of water. And so I'm guessing this area maybe to the east of the bayou toward Black Bayou Lake probably floods out fairly.
And actually, that particular slide shows a very interesting problem. 2016, if you track Bayou Desert, that area that where you see the bend in the approximate middle picture is a place that's a residential neighborhood called Treasure Island. And in 2016, in the what would be the left portion of our screen, the very tip that sticks out, a lot of homes in that area were flooded with the initial surge of rain that we had that flooded Bayou Desert. But as the water ran off, it collected and continued back out into Black Bayou. That, for a large area, Black Bayou takes that water in. If you'll note, there is.
Is that a channel right there to the north?
Yeah, well, we'll go back to it, but there's a channel. You see the railroad track that runs immediately behind the subdivision. Blow that up, I'll get a little bit more, please, Karen. Oh, okay. Right there where you had the cursor back up a little bit, and you see the channel into what is Hannah's Run, which then runs back into Bayou Desert. There's two flood control structures. There's one on the railroad tracks and there's one at almost Bayou Desert. The one at Bayou Desert hadn't been functioning. How many years, Kevin? A lot. But what we had after the initial floods subsided was the back end of the subdivision that did not experience any flooding in the initial flash flood. As Black Bayou took in all that water and could not get it out of Hannah's Run fast enough. Hannah's Run is kind of like the bathtub stopper where all the water flows.
Yeah.
That body. It ended up flooding Stevenson Street there that runs parallel to the railroad track. And basically, that whole area stayed underwater for approximately 5 weeks with backwater. So, I mean, you've got both types of floods. You had your flash flood in the forward part, and you had a backwater flooding in the rear part of the island.
Does the railroad itself kind of serve as a de facto levee?
It does, and I honestly, my opinion is had the railroad levee it's only about 4 feet high.
Okay.
And if you've seen railroad construction, you and I are real familiar with this, aren't we, Randy? Yeah. Tell you how deep it washed out.
For everybody to realize, we have Kevin Crosby with Lazenby Associates is the police jury's, Washoe Police Jury's engineer. Randy Denman is here from Denman Engineering. He's with the city of Monroe. Of course, Kim Golden is here as the city's engineer as well.
But the way that they construct those is they, of course, build a clay base, and then they stack on top of that the rock. And the rock is to be permeable to allow the water to run off the tracks and then between the cross ties down to that base. Well, as long as the water stays below the clay base, it accesses it. And once it reaches a certain height and it gets to where it's at that, where the SD2 type gravel rock is, that's a permeable layer, and it starts cutting into that. And it actually cut into that levee at a point just north of Hannah's Run, and it started to flow into that area there. I believe that track was constructed in 1905 and 1906 or so. And I honestly believe that track weren't there today, probably sometime in one of these floods that begin to occur in the 70s, 80s, in that time frame. That last street on Stevenson there would probably be part of Black Bayou.
Yeah.
If it weren't for the railroad.
How does the Black Bayou connect to the? I'm not even gonna Bayou. Say that again.
Bayou Desert.
So I mean, is that like a culvert running through there?
Well, there's all this is the Black Bayou watershed here.
Yeah.
This area here is Hannah's Run.
Got it. Okay.
It's a small body of water that runs through. And I say small, it's wider than just 4 or 5 times wide.
Those of you joining by Zoom, he's pointing at right where the cursor is. That's that Hannah's Run.
Yeah, and Hannah's Run begins. This is all low level. Right here is a flood control structure in the tracks. Right here, it's three pipes there with valves. And then up here is another flood control structure that is not operable. But police trees acquired some funds from capital outlay to fix that structure. but the water connects to Bayou Desir here and here through this.
Okay.
But you have, the odd part was in 2016, most of your initial flooding was here. You didn't have any flooding here, but as the watershed itself took on the water and then started to try and release that water, its only point of release was here. And so it basically wiped out that whole area there.
Would that be considered a fluvial flooding instead of the true backwater type flooding?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be a combination of the fluvial with an F and pluvial with a P. Yeah, I mean, really, the backwater flooding is a subset of riverine flooding. But, we can talk about it.
The backwater flooding is due to what now?
No, backwater flooding, it's a type of fluvial flooding. It's not necessarily
The definition, would that be that the water can't go anywhere, then it has to spread out?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So yeah, we don't have to be overly technical. I mean, it's.
I'm just trying to figure out what.
But I'm glad that we had this discussion, because one of the things that I think we didn't quite point out, you've got a lot of materials in front of you here in the room, and you'll see, maps. And one of the things that we'd like for you all to do, as we're highlighting spots that maybe we need to do a little more research on, maybe we need to look at a little closer as problem areas that may be good for projects moving forward. If you all could be so kind, and you don't have to do this today, but over the next several days and weeks, if you can kind of mark up the maps that we've provided. And Brad, can you hold up the envelopes? We've got addressed stamped envelopes. So, at your leisure, if you could kind of highlight for us on the map where we should be pinpointing for more intensive study and mail that back to us, that would be really helpful. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the presentation. Go ahead, Ben.
And Matt, I did want to include that, if there's any specific maps that y'all need from us, we'll be going through some inset maps. If you need copies of those, please let us know, and we'll send you some digital copies of those inset maps that we'll review at the end of the exercise as well.
Y'all can let me know what y'all need, and I will communicate that with them.
All right, let's go to the next slide, please. So this is the rainfall totals that were documented throughout Region 3 in March 2016. And the first thing that I'd like to point out, just from a visual perspective, is that we got so much rain, not only in Region 3, but across the state. We kind of ran out of colors in the color scale. So you'll see we got into these weird gray colors. The gray colors are actually the highest amounts of rainfall that took place in Region 3 during that time frame. And so you see this whole quadrant, I guess this northwest quadrant of Region 3 is where most of the rainfall was localized. And, we point this out because we think 2016 was something of a pivot point for not only us at the state, but obviously for you all that experienced extreme degrees of flooding here, in the sense that this really told us that we needed to take a much harder look at these types of rainfall events, the types of flooding that took place in 2016, and not necessarily take our focus off of the coast, but certainly expand how we think about flood risk and how much time and effort we put into studying flood risk to include what happens in places like Region 3. And so that's why we're here, and that's what we're intending to do over the next couple of years. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Now, as we discussed, so just to, I guess, get the terminology correct, a fluvial flood is caused by excess rainfall somewhere, whether it be in the direct place that floods or somewhere upstream, and ultimately, it's when a river or creek or some type of tributary overflows its banks and leads to a flooding condition. So I thought we were going to see more on that map. Okay. The areas in light blue, and this is what I wanted to point out. These are the places that are part of the special flood hazard area. So those are the places that we would typically expect to see a higher degree of flood risk. And as we transition to Pluvial floods, as we talked about earlier, these are the areas that are more well-developed, more impervious surfaces, more water pooling, harder for water to run off properly. And so, we focused in on Monroe and West Monroe. Those are obviously the more populated areas within this region. The other thing that we'll point out here is that these dots that you see, and we'll refer to this throughout the presentation as we move forward, this represents documented instances of household flooding in 2016. So this is from FEMA individual assistance data. And as you can see, I'm sure you all experienced this. This was a region that experienced quite a bit of flooding from that event in March 2016. Next, please. Okay, back over to you.
Alrighty. Yeah. Thank you so much, Matt. So what we saw on the previous slide were those A zones, and those are mapped by FEMA. FEMA is responsible for mapping the nation's special flood hazard areas. So let's talk a little here about what they do and how they traditionally think about flood risk. Keep in mind, some of this seems to be changing for the good, so we don't want to appear critical here. FEMA is our partner in addressing mounting flood risk in the state of Louisiana. What the floodplain maps do accomplish they accomplish two different things. They provide a basis for flood insurance rates and floodplain management regulations nationwide. They inform mapped communities about their flood vulnerability, and they impact development of the built environment. Most people know the special flood hazard areas as the flood zones. This area includes land area covered by the floodwaters of the 1% annual chance event. Keep in mind that while a 1% annual event, formerly known as the 100-year flood event, may seem like a low probability, this means that there is a 26% chance of flooding in these areas during the life of a 30-year mortgage. In these areas, the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, floodplain management regulations must be enforced and flood insurance must be purchased. One thing worth noting about Region 3 is that 40% of the region resides in a flood zone. What you can see here are the two different types of flood zones that exist in Louisiana. These zones are what we consider to be the high-risk coastal zones. Those aren't as important for Region 3, obviously, because Region 3 has no coastal areas. However, A zones, as I mentioned, take up about 40% of Region 3. Can we click on that A zone button? Thank you so much. And I can't actually see, Matt, what area are we zoomed into Claiborne Parish here, and you can see those A zones, throughout the Claiborne Parish area. It looks like we're zooming out a bit. Walt, do you have anything that you want to add for this area?
Claiborne?
It's in
Yeah,
Washington.
we're in Washington. You're looking at, I think, the town of Claiborne.
You're looking at the town of
Oh,
Claiborne.
the town of Claiborne. I'm so sorry. Gotcha. Well, alrighty. Next, Evelyn, can we just let's quickly take a look at the V zones so that everyone can have an understanding of what exactly those V zones look like.
I'm zooming to it now. I just want to make sure y'all know, as we go into these kind of more interactive slides, if there are any towns or areas that the group wants to focus on, shout them out and we'll go there.
Thanks so much, Evelyn. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, these are what's being pulled up now are those V zones that are the second type of special flood hazard areas that we have in Louisiana. There we are. And here you can see Cameron Parish just along the coast. But, again, as Matt mentioned, our focus for this presentation is not the coast, but we just did want to cover the second type of special flood hazard areas. All righty, Evelyn, on to the next slide.
So, and
And here we have,
go ahead, Ben.
please, Matt. No, please, Matt.
I think this kind of cuts to the crux of the matter in the sense that this represents the census tracts and the severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss of properties therein. And so the darker the color, if you will, the higher the concentration of severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss structures. I think, Lisa, is there anything you want to add? I mean, I think we're obviously looking at the area in and around Monroe as the highest concentrations, and then down to the southern end of the region.
Yeah, go south, take it down south. Dude, that's repetitive, not just because of 216, it's from 1958, 59 to the present day.
Okay.
Let me, if you don't mind, he mentioned 1958. I want to talk about 1958 for just a second.
Sure.
On these flood risks, we have a seasonal high water period. Without question, late November, December, we can expect our seasonal high water. We get December and January, we're watching to see what's going on with the river. Once floodgates start closing around 32 feet. And, the earlier in the year that happens, the longer a winter and spring that we're going to have. And and when they built the levees, it was always known that, we're keeping the water out, but we're creating this backwater problem. We've always kind of known that. But in most of the flooding we have, that's where it comes from. We're not even at flood stage and we could start to flood once they start closing those primary gates. But there were two floods in particular that were different floods in those, 1945 and 1958. In 1958, all that water came from Arkansas, or most of it did. And that's probably our record flood elevation on 1958. Now, the 2016 flood in Arkansas and all that come down, that's 1958 again. So in all the materials I've read from you guys, looking at future conditions, maybe that scenario of all that water coming down to Ouachita to Caldwell and Catahoula does bump up a little bit. But anyway, I wanted to make that comment because he said 1958.
No, I mean, I think you're making good points in the sense that, we know that we have to understand the history of flooding here if we're going to understand anything about what might happen in the future. So, we're capturing all of these comments, I think, as was mentioned earlier, and we'll go through the research.
Since you brought it up, I just want to ask that, didn't all the work in Arkansas and the Ouachita Valley up there, didn't that make chances of, or diminish some of the chances of getting flood water?
It has somewhat, the lakes, but we still get it in Arkansas.
But-
It rains in Arkansas, it shows up here.
But see, like where you graze that rain should have been tracked up into the Arkansas area. And our area receives at some point in time.
We get a lot of water from Arkansas. This watersheds here are all sent to Arkansas.
I mean, it almost looks like a fulcrum. It just kind of, it all drains down into, I'm sorry, you had your hand up?
Yes, I didn't want to get off track if I want them to finish that conversation. I have another point just to offer at this stage. I'm Kim Golden, I'm city engineer, City of Monroe. When you look at your priorities that were stated on like the second slide and the focus on equity and project cost benefit analysis, I think we need to always keep in mind that when we're dealing with FEMA data, there is an inherent bias since it's based upon insured structures. And there are so many people, there are a lot of poor people out there getting flooded.
Amen.
That do not show up when we're dealing with just FEMA data. And so I hope the steering committee makes sure that the, ultimate coalition has mechanisms in place to be mindful of that and address that and get the data they need so it can be addressed equitably per the stated priority.
No, that's excellent. And, part of the reason why we're here, like I said, is that we know that what we can look at on a desktop review is going to be just a piece of the picture, right? So we're really relying on you all to help us fill in the rest.
And so like all these parishes out here that are white, I mean, I don't know about them, but it's gonna surprise me if there's not some flooding of poor people in those parishes that are showing up as apparently flood free. you know?
Well, so just to be clear what we're looking at, and I didn't do a good job explaining this in the front end, but they're not to say that the parishes that aren't showing severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss properties are flood free. To get on those two lists, you basically have to have 2 claims in a 10-year period.
You have to have flood insurance first.
Well, that's true. That's exactly right.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, in some of these communities, when you look at them, you'll say, look, in this flood, this area didn't flood. No, they didn't have flood insurance. But you pull up the IA, you can see where they all made IA claims. So really, you've got to get both sets to kind of get a picture.
And that's what we have here. And so we hope that's going to be useful to y'all as we all move forward. I'm sorry, was there another?
I was just gonna touch on that as well, that a lot of the repetitive losses, their rep losses, are not even in the map floodplain. So, I know that's in the slides and everything, but the flood hazard boundaries are just that. There's so much other flooding. We had things that flooded that's never flooded before. So that aren't in a floodplain, they had no flood insurance. So.
Right, and as we're looking at special flood hazard areas that obviously come from FEMA confirmed, we know that those aren't perfect articulations of flood risk, right? And so you all introduced your modeling team to kick off this meeting. I think what we're all hoping to get from those modeling teams is really good understanding of what flood risk does look like in a more accurate way. All right, anything else before we move on? All right, Evelyn. So in talking about, this is why we like to use 2016 as kind of a proxy for talking about flood risk, not only in Region 3, but really in the balance of state, because as you articulated, this was a significant flooding event for 56 parishes, and it didn't necessarily track along the special flood hazard areas, the places where we would normally expect to see flooding take place. And so for the twin disasters in 2016, we basically saw a situation in which, based on the IA data that you talked about, half of the people that had reported flood damages were within the recognized floodplain, and half the people that reported damages were outside of that. And that's a significant problem, because obviously, if you talk about the rates at which people carry flood insurance on their properties, you're much more likely to carry a policy because your mortgage holder is going to require you to carry one if you're in the flood zone than if you're out of the flood zone. So
some just can't afford it. They just can't afford it.
That's exactly right as well. One of the things we want to talk about is the fact that we had over 10,000 structures with demonstrated impact in Region 3. And in this particular region, the breakdown was even more drastic than we saw in other places across the state, and that 2/3 of those structures were outside of the floodplain. So that's a devastating event. I'm sure I don't have to tell you all that were up here in 2016. And so, as we hone in on the places that at least we think from our, again, desktop review we need to look at a little closer, we really wanted to focus on those places that had high levels of demonstrated flooding in 2016.
I'd like to make a comment
Sure.
about some of the areas that are showing up. I'm in Morehouse Parish, and that map is very deceiving, because I'll tell you, we didn't have many claims because we have 280,000 acres of cropland. We have 180,000 acres of timberland. And all the population is kind of bunched up on the ridge. But I'm telling you, in 2016, I walked into areas to look and see when the water crested, and there was sheet flowing across that 280,000 acres. Water was sheet flowing across that. It was the most water I've ever seen.
Hey, where is that? Can we
In Morehouse
find
Parish.
that real quick? Evelyn?
And it looks like we're sitting there and there's nothing going on. But the reason there's nothing showing up is because you didn't have claims, because there really aren't that many people living in those areas, because they have better sense than to do that. But all of that cropland, large, I won't say all of it, but large portions of that cropland went underwater. I own a couple hundred acres up in there. And there were areas of that land that I had never seen water on. And I believe that the water got to maybe 105 or 106 feet in there. And the water was sheet flowing across that. I walked in on a little levee.
Talking about most of that area, so I guess like north of Mer Rouge.
So, yeah, in north of Mer Rouge, up close to Arkansas. So don't let that map fool you. There's some water coming down. Bayou Bartholomew.
So
There's
if
some
we look
water
at,
coming across there.
so that maybe that area just to the north of Mer Rouge, is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about all the way to the Arkansas line.
Morehouse
All of our
Parish is-
water is coming from Arkansas.
Morehouse Parish is primarily agricultural. And part of that is because it falls into the Mississippi alluvial floodplain. There are ridges in Morehouse, but they're not as common, and it's more akin to the areas in Arkansas that abut the Mississippi River than it is, say, where we are now, where you've got a lot of fields. It's and part of the reason it's good cropland is because it's been historically geologically flooded.
I'm just saying, don't let that map fool you. There's some water coming down Bayou Bartholomew and coming across that.
Where Kate's talking about, if you looked out across that water, it was like you were looking out across Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah.
And it was
Yes.
chocolate brown, just like the 27 flood.
And it actually inhibited, was it 425 and
Yeah,
465?
425 was closed for probably 6 to 8 weeks. 165 was closed.
And those are major traffic corridors, we're talking 4 or 5 lanes.
Bastrop was shut completely down for 3 days. You could not get out of Bastrop. And finally, 139, Highway 139 opened up.
So
where
when
you could get out of town if you wanted to.
Basically, your main corridors for southeast Arkansas into Louisiana were completely.
And also I-20 was under for how long? Week?
where did that water end up? I mean, it just
Slowly meandered into the Washita.
Go ahead,
River.
Ellen.
Yeah, it comes to me.
All right. And Bayou with food.
Do your thing.
my last question about those farmlands. So is that a lot of like, laser cut stuff and it just doesn't, the runoff
Yes.
condition is just.
And the laser cutting has impacted the flooding. Our flood maps were done in the 80s. And when they did the Map Modernization Act, they did no additional flood studies. And so we have maps that were done in the 80s, and all of that agricultural land has been land level, and the water just, it sheet flows. I've never seen anything like that. I saw the 1991 flood. I've never experienced anything like that.
Bartholomew comes down and ties into Desir. Desir ultimately ends up in Washita.
Okay.
And that's that part of it, but you get the Buff River and the Duck River.
Yeah, let's go, and those really are not true. Like we say, that's not really true, because when you got IA is the one that didn't have flood insurance. They got, and when you got to put both of the claims or the stuff together to really get a true picture. And we saved 400 something homes down just south of north of Jalma by the residents building about 1.5 miles to live themselves. That would have been red dots and yellow dots.
Yeah, we had people using poly pipe around their houses. I saw that down around Washita, down around River Styx. Just people were using poly pipe to fill it with water, to keep the water out of their houses. And I've seen people in Morehouse Parish build levees around their houses. And then come back in and tear them down again. So,
Let me ask you all this. You said that, most of the water ends up in the Washita River and flows south. You have is there an established line of communication? Like, how do you know when you're reading the flood gauge, like if it's coming down, how do you know you need to take evasive action?
Neil.
You done?
No, well, we monitor it. The U.S. Corps of Engineers got river gauges scattered all over northeast Louisiana.
And you can pull it up.
And you put it up and you say, okay, it's, my goes up 3 foot, we're gonna be up 1.5 foot. Give Kay some readings there this morning at some key locations.
Yeah, I watched the Jones and the Beacon gauges.
I watched those.
Your bid is coming. That's basically, I'm gonna say, we really lucked out because we had about a week of prep time where, Wichita Parish, y'all got within 2 days. Whatever, one or 2 days. That's the difference in the flooding and in the scenario, but, there's lots of information out there that can be.
Y'all get more water because it's you get part of what we get and everything else.
We get
Everything else.
3.1 million acres of land goes on a bridge in Harrisonburg. To the Wichita River.
Yeah, headwaters, a lot of the property he's talking about in his parish is designed to flood as the river backway, flood area. Whenever these projects were put in place back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, there were flowage easements paid, and areas was established to be flooded. If you look at your refuges, your Upper Washita, your Beth, your Russell Sage, those areas are meant to be flooded. They have been encroached upon over years because of building policies allowing it. Those areas used to be free floating. The 16 event was a morphodite type event because you had floodplains that commingled that don't normally do it. You talk about the water coming out of Bartholomew. Well, it exited Bartholomew north of the Levee District's levee system. It's uncontrolled and traveled across land into the Bonity system, which ends up into Lafourche, Duck River system. So you have waters coming from different directions that don't normally flow that way. Those gauges you're referring to are maintained by USGS and by the Corps of Engineers. Neither of them are very well maintained. We found out this year, and Kevin can tell you that we tried watching Lafourche many times, and the gauges stayed down more than they stayed up. They're not a reliable source of information to be able to predict flows throughout the region.
We've also collectively determined with these engineers that the gauges are not completely accurate now. So there's a lot of factors there that are setting you up for a disaster.
I tried to go in on that map. We need to know how much it's raining up there. Like, we don't have really that much of rain monitoring. I can monitor how high the water is in Lake Bartholomew pretty well at the Jones gauge. And it'll jump. It might say it's 2 feet on the gauge, but you gotta go back in and add the base to it to get your actual elevation. But it'll jump up. In 2016, we were at 100. We went up to about 32 at the Jones gauge. I don't remember that exactly, but it was about 32.
If you get to that, Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you get to that point at the Jones gauge, your water has already exited the bayou system, so it's running over land.
Yes.
The problem that we had during that time frame was trying to get the Corps of Engineers to provide us with inundation data. They could not provide that because they didn't have enough information from the gauges north of it, and then plus whenever it comes up over land, they just couldn't model it.
Right. Yeah, it just covers everything.
But I want to point out one thing Tracy was talking about in this region here. There are a lot of areas that are designated as sacrificial, that are designed to be flooded by the Corps. They bought flooding easements, they bought wildlife management areas. In the overall modeling, the federal government is not going to let you go in and make those sacrificial areas flood-proof. This is take around Jonesville. They got a levee around Jonesville to protect them. Just about everything else is considered sacrificial. So the modelers have to keep that in mind. And you might take a little island out there and say, yeah, but they're not going to let you take these vast areas that are considered sacrificial, take them out of the floodplain because of the upstream and downstream effects. So the modeling consultants on the front end are going to have to know what are those, and then you can find out, you can just go back and look at the federal projects. But there's huge areas in this watershed. You can see them right there. They're not going to let you go. There's massive flood control measures in those. You got a little troubled area that you can fix that.
Hey, gang, can we just, this conversation is amazing, but can we just make sure that everyone's speaking, just speaking loudly so that the folks dialing in can hear? We're starting to have a little trouble with the audio.
And that's the point I wanted to make from the watershed modeling. On the front end, that's something we gotta identify. We have these areas that Tracy's talking about, the federal government paying for flood easements on it. You got owners out there have no idea that happened. And then they have huge tracts of federal land out there. You're not gonna be able to take the water off.
I'd like to know where the homeowner is, that landowner is, because mine floods, I don't, never got a penny. But there is tracts out there that's privately owned.
No,
I don't think you can contain the kind of water
No.
that I saw. You can't contain that. It's, when you have a flood like that up in those agricultural areas, it's gonna flood. I just want you to be aware that all of that water is headed your way.
Yeah, we just gotta hurry up and try to get it to Ellis quicker.
Right. That's the whole goal. We'll get the game board out to get some of you. What do you? Yeah.
no, I think, and I want to make sure I'm saying this right so that we capture it for the record. We can go do the right homework. So, I mean, we need to go figure out the history of projects that have happened in this region going back 120 years or so.
Since the 1927 Flood Control Act. But also you got to take into account that the water that goes to Ellis starts at Mena, Arkansas, goes across to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, almost to Little Rock. So everything in that Washita Basin ends up all the way over to Lake Claiborne, all the way to the Mississippi River, ends up at Ellis. So it's not just the water that falls here. We're more concerned about the water that falls north of us, causing us more problems. If it falls at Monroe, it's Ellis's problem soon. That's just fact.
Yeah.
If it falls up there in the Lake Washita, Lake Gray area, it takes 8 to 10 days to get to Monroe. We know that. So it gives us a little bit of reaction time. If it goes over towards Pine Bluff, it hits the Bartholomew system, it's going to get here a whole lot faster. There's a lot more things in place on the core projects, which is the lake systems, Greason and all that, to monitor flow than there are on the eastern side around the Bartholomew system. It is a scenic river. So you're very limited on what you can and cannot do on that system. But at the same time, there are less gauges that are maintained and less data to provide modeling data for us to plan off of up in Arkansas.
Okay. Well, I mean, we're certainly aware of the gauge problem. I think that's something we've heard in a lot of different regions across the state. So we're definitely honing in on that as a potential solution across the board.
Scroll your map down to Harrisonburg, just go straight south.
Evelyn?
Well, whichever one.
Say that one more time, y'all.
Just drag us south a little bit if you don't mind.
Gotcha.
Okay, all right. You see at the bottom, okay, we just cursor to the left. To the left. And up.
So much due west of
Right.
Hillsborough there?
That all this water comes within an area that has maybe a quarter mile wide. Half mile, quarter and a half mile, that is a squeeze of the hourglass.
Talking about Three Rivers?
Now I'm talking about Harrisonburg.
Okay, but all that's federal project. It can't be modified. You cannot modify the project without going through a federal.
I'm just trying to maybe explain to them that.
No, that's good. I mean, we'll figure out what's doable and what's not. But we need to understand the flow.
And as long as it gets out, Washita, Caldwell, Richmond, you still won't have water until it's able to get itself out.
Is there anything else anybody has on their mind before we move on?
On the discussion of Region 2, they built a topo map of this area, and it really describes what's really happens. I mean, where the water can have to.
Hey, can we work with Mark and maybe get the topo map added to this?
We can absolutely do that. We can, Ellis, I know that you like the topo maps for Region 2, so we'll definitely work to get those for Region 3 as well.
Okay, good deal. All right, Ben, I think we're back over to you.
Alrighty. Before we dive into the final data sets for the day and take a look at those inset maps, we wanted to discuss with everyone, Evelyn, if you could shift over to the next set or the next map for us. we wanted to discuss how we can work with nature within Region 3. We can start to take stock of what we first need to start doing is taking stock of the wetland areas in Region 3, because as you can see from the map that we have on the screen now, the amount of wetlands in Region 3 is rather significant. These areas function as natural sponges that trap and slowly release the surface water, rain, groundwater, and floodwaters. The trees, the root maps, and other wetland vegetation also slow the speed of floodwaters and distribute them more slowly over the floodplain. Tracy, that gets back to what you were saying, where when it rains in the northern part of the state, or you go into Arkansas, even into Little Rock, the more time that you can slow down that water flowing southward, it gives the area more time to prepare for the floodwaters, and it also, it gives time. It slows the amount of water arriving all at once, which is incredibly important in mitigating flood risk. All of this combined with water storage and breaking action, it lowers flood heights and reduces erosion. Wetlands within and downstream of urban areas are particularly valuable, counteracting the greatly increased rate and volume of surface water runoff from pavement and buildings. The holding capacity of wetlands helps control floods and prevents waterlogging of crops. Preserving and restoring wetlands together with other water retention can often provide the level of flood control otherwise provided by expensive dredge operations and levees. The bottomland hardwood riparian wetlands along the Mississippi River once stored at least 60 days of floodwater. Now they store only about 12 days because most of those areas have been filled or drained. I don't have to tell everyone in this room, what those wetland features are in Region 3, but as I mentioned before, you can see from the map that there are extensive wetland features within Region 3 that we should be taking advantage of when it comes to mitigating flood risk in Region 3.
Yeah, I think we've kind of talked about this in the last discussion. One of the things we may need to think about, we understand where there's farmland, if we understand where there's core encumbered property that's already holding water, if only for a temporary period of time before it ends up in Ellis. If there's a way that we can enhance the capabilities of those lands, I think that's something we certainly need to look at. Right, Ben?
All righty. Evelyn, can you move on to, there we go. The final data set we wanted to discuss with everyone before we actually moved into the mapping exercise is the Social Vulnerability Index. Here we have, pulled up the entire region, but what you can see are that the Social Vulnerability Index is broken up by population, and you can see that the size of those chunks are generally drawn up by the larger chunks will have a sparser population, where the smaller areas will have a more condensed population. It's important to consider the Social Vulnerability Index when looking at flood risk, because the areas that are darker red are the areas that are going to have a harder time recovering from a major flood event because they are the more vulnerable areas. What we'll do later is you can actually overlay this map with the repetitive loss data, which will show us the areas and the population centers that are particularly vulnerable and are going to have a harder time recovering from those major flood events. Evelyn, can you click down into the Monroe area for us? Here we are. And, as I mentioned, the smaller chunks of land that are broken up show the areas that have a higher population in these regions. And you can see here that while we have these smaller chunks in the Monroe area, they are the areas that are they're high when it comes to the vulnerability index. And we also know that the Monroe area was hit hard with the flooding. As we looked at the previous maps with the IA data, in the repetitive loss data, you see that the Monroe area is particularly vulnerable. And you'll also see that the vulnerability index does look brighter on the other population centers within Region 3.
And I think I think we have some dissent in the room.
Yeah. Basically, your index
All righty.
backwards.
Really? Can you elaborate on that at all?
Well, you're actually showing us the high vulnerability that the either vacant properties where nobody lives or the more, affluent areas.
Yeah, just an example.
So it's just exactly opposite.
Let's make sure we didn't invert this data set, Ben.
It
Okay.
would be perfect if the yellow was red, and
Yeah.
the red was yellow.
Okay. That might be a technical error on our part. We will check that and make sure that
Actually, who built this?
this came from our partners at CSRS. Dark data set though, so I mean, we may have just put it in backward and colored it.
Yeah, I'll look into that. That's
That's good to know.
interesting.
If we did that, I'm sorry. That's certainly embarrassing.
Yeah. Should be embarrassed to get it right. Pay a lot of money for this.
All right. Well, yeah, we'll put that number 1 on the list of stuff to
Yeah.
look at.
That's priority 1 to figure out.
Here. So, I mean, every disaster I've worked for the state of Louisiana has had 2 things in common. One, we talked about a few minutes ago, and that there's always a high volume of properties that are outside of the flood zone. And the second thing is, every time there's been a flooding event that I've worked, we've always had disproportionate impact with low-income populations. So our most vulnerable folks tend to live in our most vulnerable areas, and that's a problem that we really want to get a handle on through the watershed initiative.
In 2016, FEMA produced a social vulnerability index impact that they provided to us. And everything that we were seeing those low income, it lined up. The CDC produces the same thing. If you look at their
This is
literature-
the CDC data. I think we just put it in back.
Yeah. So the CDC data has a lot of literature on what it's supposed to be telling you. And if you read that, it's exactly what we saw in 2016. And if you weren't aware of that data set, you were misunderstanding what was actually going on in the community.
Yeah.
So it was a good tool.
No, that's good. And I mean, the social vulnerability index is something that we really started using at the state level in 2016. And, we have found as we've gone across the state that it is largely tracked with a lot of the impacts that we've seen on the ground. So that's been a useful data set for us for sure.
Well, as these houses flood, the price goes down.
Mhm.
And so people buy the houses thinking that there's not gonna be another flood for 100 years, that scenario. And they'll buy those houses, and I worked for the city of Monroe for 5 years, and you have areas in the city of Monroe where it's very difficult to get the water out of those areas.
Yeah, and we've seen that. So, folks will have their wealth tied up in real estate that has been passed down from generation to generation. And as flooding events take place, the value of that real estate goes down to, in some cases, ultimately zero. And then, when there's a buyout program, let's say, it becomes really difficult to work with those folks because the calculation based on a market valuation just is not sufficient to really help those folks out. So we're certainly aware of that. A lot of the buyout programs that we've operated in the past few years have included a housing incentive on the back end that basically says, if we'll have this part of the equation that's the buyout based on market value, the incentive will match what it actually costs to buy a home in a location outside of the floodplain. So we've seen that all over the state, but certainly glad that you pointed that out. Ben, let's get away from this terrible map.
Yeah, let's move on to the next map. So we're going to take, if everyone agrees, let's take about a 5-minute break. We'll be back online at like 11:35. I think it'd be good for us to just use the restroom, get a glass of water, and we'll revisit we'll start the mapping exercise in about 5 minutes. Thanks so much.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm good with that, but, format, I'd like y'all to actually present those reports, walk us through it. And then invite discussion.
Oh.
What your analysis is showing us, we're focused on the next steps going forward. You're integrating that those are, based on their experience. Yeah, it needs, needs to be Tom, Charles, Will.
Yeah, it's a lot of information. We hope that,
Key participants are.
we're gonna build, like, this is kind of a foundational piece of information that will help the regional steering committees make decisions about projects,
Yeah, those
governance,
four
plan,
are
or whatever.
the four that we need.
So, and it's, for anyone in the room to be a part of the
Keeping up
conversation.
with what I've got going on.
Are you on the committee or? Okay. Gotcha.
So, you been on the job?
Yes, sir.
This one, I just looked at.
I thought-
You want to make like yourself a thing?
Yeah, let's do that.
It
took a while.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing what 20 years, 20 or 30 years they've been. Yeah, I think y'all, that's kind of froze up there. Just like your thing is. I was,
Thank you, Daddy.
Construction.
And it's basically creates a hydraulic dam.
Yeah, and it backs up behind it. One of the things that we're trying to do, though, I mean, from a technical FEMA-based definition, right? They talk about surge flood risk, fluvial. Get everybody's vocabulary on the same page, and if we're not talking about a whole other subset of flooding.
I'll stand here, right, pull that out after.
I've had 3 minutes.
Mississippi River. Awesome. And this is the. I got 4, I got, my parents, I got 3 major rivers running out.
We got a lot.
So, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying, the velocity of those 3 rivers.
Okay. Well, that would have come down here. The L, 4 river control company. Okay. They call it 70-30, 30% of Mississippi, and just to a certain level, come across here. Their numbers, when they publish their numbers. 40 to 40.
You're married to a farm.
It stops.
It's sitting there for
And
a good hour.
this rain, this stuff down. And it starts leaking. More 50, 60 foot. Well, that's just what we got me and do. Oh, and the country, back over here is flat.
I guess there'll be some more.
It shows what.
Right, the-
What it comes from, right there.
Basically, northwest to south.
Yeah, it's basically.
That's right.
This line that they got here is basically right over.
Well, there's still things.
Well, that's the thing.
I've got, how do y'all know what to think of these?
You may see a map, this is kind of relate, that's right here. I got one at Rivers Hill, which is 16, go by one day.
Oh, it's still there.
Little rivers are flowing east or west.
What towns are, I know about that.
What, Jonesville. Come see sometime, I'll tell you something very interesting.
I'd love to.
We have a facility down there that we might get out of workshop at, and that's southern part. And we're trying to have private. Or would y'all be willing to go to private?
Well,
I'm willing to go to sit more southern. I may have a place to play. Because I was trying to get the accent. I have connections there, but they were never used because of COVID.
well, I'm just saying, it doesn't matter to me, you know, anything.
Something that just-
Yeah, somebody
That's
went
what I'm
across a
looking
video,
at. I'm
right
looking
where you were
at
talking about,
Vasco,
showing that water. Going across that deal with those fields.
maybe go over
And,
to Lincoln.
This is what you
Concordia did not meet.
I said, well, like, that's.
Yeah.
Concordia attempts are very.
Exactly.
Declared each state.
That too. You know, and the thing about it was, when I saw that, I've done a lot of research.
Alrighty, gang. Now we've had a little break. I think it might be time. Yeah, it might be time for us to dive back in.
Everybody come back to order.
Take care.
We're resuming the watershed meeting. They're on their own after that.
Right, do everything you can and then be.
Take your seats, everyone. Y'all remember your side conversations are picked up on the mic.
Don't worry, Karen. We haven't heard anything too good yet.
I know, I'm just trying to remind them.
I was joking.
I just looking at it.
Yes. And I'm recording it too.
Just wait till the final folks take their seats and dive back in.
Right, Ben, just given that we're running a little short on time, let's try to be abbreviated.
Yeah, that works for me. Evelyn, can you move on to the next slide for us? Thanks so much. Matt, do you want to take us into the recap?
Yeah, and I just want to touch on some of the things we talked about. You know, we talked about the different types of flood risk, surge, pluvial, fluvial. We talked about different things that you might see on a FEMA flood insurance rate map, special flood hazard areas, A zones, B zones. We talked about repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss, and you all talked about how that data may not be capturing everything that's happening within this region that we can go take a look at. Certainly talked about the impacts of the flooding events in 2016, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. Talked about the wetland areas, right? So we talked a lot about properties that have been encumbered by the Corps. We talked a lot about farmlands that have been holding stormwater and riverine water recently. And so those are obviously areas that we need to take a closer look at. In other words, how do we take advantage of some of the naturally occurring attributes within this particular region and maybe use those to our advantage. And then finally, we talked about social vulnerability, although obviously we've got to go take a look at our data and make sure that we've got that right. But rest assured, we will get you an answer to that question very quickly. So with that in mind, we've got a mapping exercise set up, and I'll be totally frank in just letting you all know that, as we were thinking about this flood risk and vulnerability presentation, we didn't know that COVID was going to happen. This was kind of in February and into early March. And so we kind of had this idea that we'd all be sitting around, huddled up, marking up maps, trying to figure out the areas that flood out and why they flood out, and taking data in that way. So given the reality of the moment, we can't do that. But we did attempt to improvise, and Evelyn, if you can get us going here. So, and again, I'll be brief in the interest of time. Where we left off this story map is to combine the special flood hazard areas with the documented instances of household flooding via IA data and social vulnerability, which again, I know we got to go take a look at. The idea being we wanted to isolate those places in which we saw high degrees of flooding in highly vulnerable areas. And we wanted to do that as a conversation point. We get feedback from you all as to what's really going on in these particular places. It's one thing for us in Baton Rouge or in New Orleans to look at maps and dots and special flood hazard areas and the like. But you all, live here and you work here, and these are your friends and neighbors, and we really need to know what's really going on the ground if we're going to be effective as we move forward. So, Evelyn, can you take us in? Let's just kind of briefly go through the regions that we've highlighted.
So we have a couple kind of locations that we've identified that we can kind of scroll through one by one. I'm just going to call them out in a list first. We have the whole region: Farmerville, Homer, Monroe and West Monroe, Richwood, Tallulah, and Abair and Winnsboro. So I'm going to click through these, but don't be shy and jump in. If we're not hitting a place that we need to zoom to, we can quickly get there. So I'm just going to go ahead and go right into Farmerville, but y'all let us know where we need to move it to.
So again, we're looking for problem areas, right? What are the places that we really need to hone in on? And as I talked about a little while ago, the maps that we've handed out, we'd like for you guys to mark those up. Or if there's any other way that you can provide good information back to us as to the places we should be looking at, that's good too. But this is, we're trying to gather information, right? If that makes sense.
Did you add Bastrop? I didn't hear her say Bastrop.
Yep, we can certainly take a look at Bastrop.
You didn't have any of the south area either. South of Winnsboro.
Just give her a town.
Brownsville, Harrisonburg.
Let me ask this. So, I mean, we've obviously had a fairly extensive conversation about different aspects of flooding. Are there areas or topics that we haven't talked about that anybody has in their mind that we should focus in on?
The economic impact that was from 2016, whenever you have 25,000 acres of farmland that didn't get planted because of parish. That's an economic.
Yeah, that's real. Okay.
We kind of missed that last comment, those of us on the phone. Do you think y'all could repeat that?
So, Evelyn, can you hear me?
I can.
The comment was about the economic damages that take place when, say, a 25,000 acre farm goes offline and can't be planted as a result of a flooding event. I'm wondering, so to what extent has this group had, is there somebody that kind of represents the farmers in the area? Is there a collection of large planners that we can talk to? Or?
Yeah. Well, I think that might be something we can address at the community meetings. I'm sure we're going to have some farmers show up.
Yeah, we actually have someone on the committee that's not here today that kind of represents some of that. But we will definitely engage some for our workshops.
Great.
And not just a single flood event on the economics, the repetitive nature and what it does to the brand of a community, trying to attract new business. when any company in the United States looking for a place to locate and come pull up and look at the frequency of these events and know, see what's going on there.
You mentioned earlier the seasonal flooding that takes place in this region. Is that becoming worse over time, or is that okay?
That's 5 years.
Last 5 years it's gotten worse. Okay. Where does the seasonal flooding largely take place?
When I said seasonal flooding, what I'm referring to is our annual rainfall when it occurs.
Yeah.
And where it occurs. Because the river does not have to be at flood stage for us to have the backwater problem. These gates start closing, and then we get a heavy rainfall event on top of that, we start having problems. And you know what? That can go on from January to June. As long as those gates are closed.
Is there a specific place that we can look at?
That is actually, what he's talking about is up and down the entire Washita Black navigation project.
Like how many gates you got?
Hundreds.
Oh, okay.
We shut hundreds of floodgates at different river levels on the Washita Black project. Once we do that, every agency in this room that pushes their water out to the Washita has to do it in an artificial manner, be it pump station or.
Okay. I got you now.
So they're holding everything they got until they get it to us through via pump.
Well, I would think that, I mean, the condition doesn't really, until you raise the gates back up, right?
But this past year we quit pumping, and my agency represents 8 parishes. So we quit pumping water in the 1st of June.
Okay.
And that is from Arkansas all the way down to Ellis.
I like how Ellis has gotten to be the location. It's not a town name, it's a person.
I'm gonna say it back.
That's around nobody wants.
When the Europeans first come here, water was a mode of transportation. It was great because we had to come through us, and we have the old Monroe Road, the old Columbia Road, the old Gina Road. Basically, if you wanted something in Monroe, you come to Harrisburg to get it because it's far north they can get the steamboats. So that's until the modern transportation system come in. It was great for us. Harrisburg was full of warehouse, but as things change. But if you really look at just like I said about the topo system, for 150 years we was great. We probably have some of the richest farm ground in the state of Louisiana. When you say San Diego, Harrisburg area, we talking about 200 bushel of corn right now without irrigation, 3 bale cotton, 70, 80 bushel of beans, due to what Mother Nature's done over the millions of years. But it's also now it's done become a problem because of actions of federal agencies below us and around us. It's changed this whole picture up. It's the whole drainage system up. So that's why I'm screaming.
So, I mean, forgive me if this is an obvious question, but I mean, I assume farming is the dominant industry in this region, right?
Agriculture with farming and timber. I mean, you got a mill down here that probably takes in how many 100,000 tons a day of timber.
I just looked at the numbers on how much farm and timber and marshland that we have that's under use value assessments. And 92% of Morehouse Parish acreage has a use value assessment on it. That's why we're so poor up there. So you probably have something similar.
Right. Everybody wants to pay more taxes.
But it's hard to support a parish off of 8% of acreage that part of it's in nonprofits and public use and parks and it's tough.
Back to the acres, the USDA probably could, because you report that lost acreage to the USDA, and you probably be surprised how much for the Morehouse, Tinsall, West Carroll, East Carroll, Hallwell, how many thousands of acres that was not even planted in 16 because they say, okay, June first, the cutoff date, you don't plan nothing behind it.
Let me ask you, we had a farm relief program up here after 2016. Does anybody know anybody that participated in that? I mean, was it
That's the only reason they still in business, and some of them still.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, that sounds like success to me.
In terms of data sets, from the agricultural relief, from USDA and those SBA's always been kind of elusive, but when you can't get the FEMA deck, you've gone after the SBA. So that may be some other information that may tell part of the story.
Okay. All right. I know we're getting real short on time. Is there anything else anybody would like to talk about before we turn things back over for the normal order of business?
Real quick, y'all, I just want to bring up, I went ahead and refreshed this map, the social vulnerability map, and so we did improve the visuals here. Let me just share that again. Thanks to everybody for pointing that out. That is extremely helpful. I'm just going to put that up, and then I'm going to go back to the mapping exercise. So thanks again, and feel free to jump in if you want to go back to any areas within this region. We will zoom in, and then we will pull that social vulnerability over so that you can see both layers, the IA, the flood zones, and the social vulnerability.
Wait, Evelyn, did we confirm that it was backward?
Yeah, they fixed it.
It was, at least parts of it were, because when I refreshed, I did see improved visuals that looked like what the group pointed out.
Yeah, I'm looking at that northeast track. If you put the social vulnerability slider back over. Yeah, that one went from yellow to red. Okay.
Thank you guys again.
Yeah, certainly appreciate you all pointing out our mistake on that. And like I said, if you all would be so kind as to kind of mark up some maps and send them back to us and help us capture some of the discussion that we had here today. Obviously, we're recording it. We'll go back and review and do the research we need to do based on what we talked about. But that said, one more thing.
Yes, one thing on the IA data set and on the NFIP data set, like looking what you're looking at, if you were to grid that in a way based on proximity of those of each loss, I mean, it might, but if you do it that way as a heat map, it might help you zero in on those areas.
Okay, we can certainly look at that. With that said, I've certainly appreciated the discussion. I've learned a lot. Hope this was informative for you all. Again, thank you for hosting us, and I appreciate all your hospitality.
Yep. Thank y'all so much, everyone, and I look forward to seeing y'all in person in the near future.
Thank y'all for participating in the discussion. I'm so glad we had the guys here from the state. I really felt like we needed to have them here for this presentation and not it totally to be Zoom. As good as Zoom is, there's something good about looking people in the eye and actually talking. So we appreciate them making the trip up. They are passing out envelopes so that you can mark your map up and send it in to them with any points you want to make sure they know about. At this point, this is a public meeting, and we will have a moment for participation. Yes, Ben?
Karen?
Yes?
Hey, this is Ashley. Is there any way we can get a copy of what they're passing out, the maps to mark up?
Yes, I can do that.
Hi, Ashley. This is Ben Wicker here. I'll make sure you get a copy of all these maps.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Everything will be digital.
Okay, we will get that to y'all. Is there any member of the public would like to make any comment while we're here? I'm noting nobody from the public wanting my attention to speak.
I do close public hearing at this time.
Okay. Okay, so motion second. Any discussion? All in favor? All against?
Aye.
Motion carries. Okay, with that, thank y'all again for being here. Our next meeting of the steering committee is scheduled for September the 17th. It'll probably be in this room. Before then, though, we'll probably have some of those workshops I was discussing, but that will be sent out to you separate notification. So with that, we're going to say the meeting is adjourned.
Thanks, guys. Great meeting.
Thank you.
Yeah.